The 1840s Great Reset, the secret civilization erased from your history books. The bodies turned up first, stacked under a sewer trench where a sidewalk used to be. 2 streets over, windows were brick from the inside, and the ground floor sat 3 feet below today's pavement. In London, a doorway sealed in stone led to steps that went down, not up. A New York shop sold hats half underground, and nobody asked why. Then the dates hit. 1842, 1845, 1849, fires that ate cores of cities. If there was a reset, our present was engineered. To see it, we rewind fast. 3 pillars, no leaps, stones, papers, power. Your city map might be a lie. Road map, the 3 pillars and why they matter. Here's how we're going to test this without turning into late-night guesswork. First, the stones. Buildings don't argue. Across continents, you see buried floors, window wells where daylight should be, and entrances now below the sidewalk. In Chicago, the 1850s and 1860s street raising lifted blocks by as much as 3 to 10 feet, burying original thresholds behind neat rows of new steps. Seattle followed with regrades in the early 1900s, slicing hills and leaving the old street level under glass vault lights. The official line says drainage and sanitation. We'll ask, drainage of what, and why did so much already sit below? Next, the paper. Fires between 1842 and 1849 didn't just blacken skylines, they erased memory. Hamburg's 1842 inferno consumed the historic core. New York's 1845 blaze gutted the financial district. St. Louis in 1849 lost its riverfront and the records that proved who owned what. Afterward, there's a pattern. Municipal bonds issued at speed. Improvements underwritten with new debt and administrative reshuffles, street renamings, lot mergers, renumberings, that turn yesterday's map into a rumor. We'll track where lost in the fire becomes a legal solvent, dissolving titles and obligations into opportunity. Third, the power, who stepped into the vacuum. In the 1850s through the 1900s, municipal machines and rail syndicates bloom. Public works empires arrive, sewers, waterworks, eminent domain, framed as progress but yoked to repayment calendars from those post-fire bonds. Watch how debt timetables quietly set rebuild timelines, zoning, even what counts as unsafe. Education reforms publish new civic histories that flatten discontinuities. Industrial trusts, insurers, land banks, and newspaper magnates scale up on the back of catastrophe. We'll weigh modernization as explanation, then check who held the pen when the ledger reopened. Our rules are simple. No leaps. We'll flag speculation and park it. We'll weigh counterpoints. Subsidence, routine regrading, wooden cities lit by gas lamps, absolutely. But we'll challenge coincidence with pattern and local causes with global sync. If these anomalies cluster in the same 20-30-year window across cities that didn't share planners, we ask why. If the fixes appear after the fact rather than before, if elevation changes are documented only once the dirt's already moved, that matters. Why the 1840s? Because everything convulsed at once. Revolutions in Europe, railroads wiring time and space, cholera ripping through dense neighborhoods, and sovereign debt crises flipping who owed whom. The Panic of 1837 set states and cities wobbling. By the mid-1884s, defaults and restructurings gave bankers leverage and gave politicians a story, improvement or collapse. In that atmosphere, a fire isn't just a disaster, it's a blank page with lenders waiting. We're building this as a stress test. Every act closes a loop, then opens a bigger one. We'll start with stones you can touch, then match them to map inconsistencies, then track the money that cemented the rebuild. Along the way, we'll bring in ordinary people. A landlord staring at a half-buried parlor window, a street digger finding steps that go nowhere, a clerk who signs off on a renumbered block and realizes last month's addresses are gone for good. Micro-stories keep the stakes human. To avoid pareidolia, we'll use timelines, corroboration, and cross-city matches. If we can't date a buried doorway before a known regrade, we won't claim it. If a star-shaped earthwork was always a fort and was simply obsoleted by artillery, we'll say that. But if a star fort becomes a park exactly when adjacent streets jump in elevation, we'll hold that up. Fort Wood, an 11-point star, became the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. Across coasts, batteries get rebranded, landscaped, and folded into leisure space. Defense goes quiet, utilities get loud. Here are the documentary-specific hooks we'll use. Every 30 seconds, we'll add a detail. A surveyor's note reading existing wall where no wall should be. A ledger line for bond interest that predates the published ribbon cutting. A newspaper clipping that downplays a mass grave as another Potter's Field adjustment during sewer works. We'll shift perspective. What the landlord saw, what the engineer saw, what the archivist filed away. And we'll plant open loops. A door bricked up in 1858, a clock replaced the same year, a census block marked uninhabited while the neighboring streets overflow. We're not here to sell a myth of lost high technology without artifacts. We're here to ask why so many cities share the same scars at the same time, and why the language of improvement, sanitation, and embellishment smoothed those scars into a story of steady progress. If the ground literally moved under them, then the story moved with it. Start with the stones. They don't lie. Then follow the papers. Then the power. If a reset happened, it wasn't a single switch. It was a method, applied, perfected, and left beneath our feet. The stones speak, buried architecture you can touch. Start at street level with your eyes, not a theory. Walk a London block with sunken areas carved into sidewalks, neat brick wells where light squeezes through to windows that now sit shoulder high to the dirt. The curb looks normal until you realize the basement window has a lintel too ornate to be an afterthought. A doorway is sealed at knee height, and the steps that should rise to meet you dive down into a darkness that isn't a cellar so much as a displaced ground floor. The stones are telling you the street moved. 2 turns later, the pattern repeats. A shop front wears its age in soot-blackened courses. Only the shop's display sits half underground. A clerk comes up 3 steps just to reach the sidewalk. Ask the landlord why. He shrugs, drainage. Ask when. He points to a date penciled on a beam, 1858. He doesn't know who buried the door, he just knows the rent still clears. Cross the ocean. New York brownstones parade their stoops like proud chins, but look at the parlor floor that architects swear was meant to impress. On some blocks, that parlor now dips below the slab that carries foot traffic. Cast iron fences try to disguise the drop. Coal chutes become excuses for light wells. Along the side streets, you find bricked arches at what used to be the street line. A tenant stores bicycles where a front door once opened to carriages. Go farther, Melbourne's tidy grid fights its hills by carving them. San Francisco pretends its basements were always basements. But when a window carries a stone keystone and the basement vault shows streetwear on its threshold, that isn't a storage room plan. That's a repurposed entrance. Here is where the dates matter. Chicago in the 1850s and 1860s made its choice in daylight. Hydraulics lifted whole blocks 3, 5, even 10 feet to solve sewage pooling and a river that ran like a wound. Crews raised hotels while guests kept dining, stacking new sidewalks above the old and leaving original thresholds buried behind fresh staircases. The official story is bold engineering. The practical result is the same scar you saw in London. Grand doorways stranded below the new line of life. Seattle follows in the early 1900s with its regrades. Hills are shaved, streets fill, and the underground is born, old storefronts entombed beneath a second layer of city. Glass vault lights pepper the new sidewalks like starry ceilings for the level below. Shopkeepers move up, not out. At Tour Today, guides talk about plumbing and mud. Stand there long enough and you'll notice the old sills wore whether the new ones never saw. Those sills faced open air until they didn't. Now walk into a churchyard wall and trace the brick. A course changes color halfway up, the lime turns to Portland, and the mortar lines clock 2 different centuries sharing the same job, hold back a street that used to be lower. Step around to the alley still whispers the older grade, dipping just enough to reveal a filled-in arch. Someone paid to make the street higher, someone else adapted. Look for oversized doors whose proportions make sense only if your feet were supposed to meet them from a foot or 2 down. Colonial and Victorian facades wear ground floors that the ground abandoned. In some places, sidewalk gratings throw light into what the realtor insists is a garden flat. In others, workmen cut air bricks into walls that never planned to be buried, channeling stale breath out of rooms built to be public. And then the shapes you're told not to notice. Star-bastioned earthworks folded into parks, laced with walking paths that pretend the points were landscaping. A plaque calls it a battery, an embankment, a place to picnic. From above, it's pure geometry. Downtown cores radiate on sensible lines from a node that used to matter in a different way. Near harbors, the old fort becomes a green buffer for families and joggers. Fort Wood, an 11-pointed star, ends up walled inside the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, its teeth showing only if you climb for a view. Counterpoints deserve their day. Cities settle, timber rots, rivers flood, engineers raise streets to dry shoes and flush waste. In Chicago, we have ledgers, tenders, and newspaper ads bragging about the lifts. In Seattle, we have photos of men standing on the belt of a new city wrapped around the waist of the old. In London, Joseph Bazalgette's sewers arrive after cholera and stink made it impossible not to act. Drainage is real. Regrading is documented. But the rhythm across places is hard to ignore. London's sealed doors share a century's breath with New York's half-buried parlors. Chicago's lifts formalize what other streets did piecemeal. Seattle's glass-lit sidewalks crown what older curbs already hinted. Where the stories are clear, they're proud. Where they're muddy, they're quiet, improvement, sanitation, embellishment. Meanwhile, the stones keep speaking. Thresholds exiled, windows gagged with bricks, arches sleeping under asphalt. A micro story, a street digger in Dublin pries at a granite step and hears it ring over a void. He knocks out a single course and dust spills into a forgotten space lined with plaster, not stone. A staircase, intact, goes down into a room that reads like ground floor, not cellar. He lights a match and finds a transom window looking straight at dirt. He calls a foreman. The foreman tells him to fill and level. Another, a clerk in a New Orleans records office, walks past crates labeled regrade assessments, stacked on top of a ledger stamped with addresses that no longer fit the map. He signs off on a permit to add a stoop where a step used to do. On his way home, he notices a row of basement windows with carved surrounds, now staring into gravel. If the stones agree, the ledgers should flinch. We've touched thresholds that lost their world. Next, we see what burned the story that explained them. The fires that ate memory, paper trails go dark. What stones whisper, fires shout. Between 1842 and 1849, the core of 3 cities went to ash. Hamburg first. May 5, 1842, a spark in Dijkstraat becomes a gale-fed furnace. 4,000 buildings, the medieval heart, libraries, guild halls, gone in 100 hours. People watched streets they'd known by smell and sound turn into a single hot wind. In the aftermath, ash didn't just settle on rooftops, it settled on memory. When buildings vanish, so do deeds pinned behind their doors, tax rolls tucked in drawers, maps rolled under counters. Hamburg city fathers talked rebirth. They also talked money. 3 years later, Lower Manhattan. Night, December 1845. Smoke punches through in the financial district, busy by day, tight as a fist after dark. 500 buildings, counting houses, warehouses, law offices where titles lived. Fire companies fight with leather hoses and grit. Heat takes the records anyway. In the morning, brokers clamber over ice-crusted rubble and find fewer ledgers than rumors. A clerk holds a charred spine of a bond registry. The pages flutter away in flakes. Lost in the fire starts as a fact. It becomes a phrase that opens doors. Then St. Louis, 1849. It starts on a steamboat, White Cloud, a name that reads like mockery later. The flame jumps ship to ship along a riverfront stacked with lumber and lard and paper. By the time dawn recognizes the city, 430 buildings are gone, docks peeled back, a courthouse gasping smoke. Death doesn't only tally bodies. It tallies functions, assessors' rooms, surveyors' cabinets, collections of plats that traced who owned the ground they'd just watched burn. Here's what comes next, and it's the part that doesn't catch fire, paper that lives. City councils meet by candlelight in borrowed rooms. Minutes show the same motion in different handwriting, authorized bonds. Improvements need cash. Streets must be widened, sewers laid, fireproof materials purchased, new grids drawn. Municipal bonds are floated at speed, underwritten by bankers who understand urgency and interest. Repayment schedules write the calendar of reconstruction. Unsafe becomes a category with dates attached. Structures that didn't fall to flame will fall to compliance. Administrative reshuffles ride the same current. New numbering schemes for streets, cleaner, more rational, they say. Names simplified, duplicated names purged, alleys folded into blocks. It makes sense if your desk holds a fresh map and a deadline. It also makes yesterday's map harder to trust. A property that was 14 Old Dock Lane becomes 112 Water Street on a Monday, and by Friday, 114, because someone redrew the lot line to match a future curb. Ask for the pre-fire designation and you'll be told to check the archives. You already know where they are, under a new wing that hasn't been built yet. Insurance surges. Companies that survive the blaze pay out and then write new rules, premiums adjusting to a city that will be brick this time, or stone or iron front. Rebuilding syndicates form. Timber disappears into contracts, and so do corners of old neighborhoods. Smallholders who can't wait months without income sell at a price that moves. Land banks collect. Parcels combine. A new street slices where none ran before. On paper, the city gets safer, straighter, and easier to tax. In lived memory, it gets unrecognizable by design. In the courtrooms that reopen, lost in the fire becomes a solvent. A widow brings a claim on a lot her husband held since before the war. The deed was in a strongbox in an office that isn't there. The judge wants a copy. There is no copy. A man 2 rows back produces a letter of intent from a lender drawn up after the blaze, tied to a bond issuance for improvements. He has cash. She has stories. The gavel doesn't believe stories. Meanwhile, newspapers carry twin tones printed on the same page. Sorrow for the dead and missing. Triumph for the phoenix. They cheer rebirth, modernization, health. At the bottom of the column, a notice: public auction of tax-delinquent properties to fund the new sewer main, proceeds earmarked for bond interest due. A week later, a profile of a contractor whose crews cleared 10 blocks in half the expected time. What nobody writes is what was carted off with the charred beams. Boxes of unsorted title abstracts swept into wagons and tipped into landfill to stabilize a new embankment. Counterpoints matter. 19th century cities were tinderboxes. Wood and pitch, narrow ways, gas lamps that hissed beside curtains. Volunteer fire brigades feuded, hydrants failed, water pressure sagged. You don't need sabotage to spark a night like 1845. But patterns matter too. 3 infernos in 7 years, each eating administrative cores. Each followed by rapid debt, orderly renaming, enforced rationalization, insurance recalibration, and a debt service clock that clicks for decades. Listen for the echo in the maps. Sanborns compiled later redraw earlier reality with confidence that can feel like arrogance. Surveyor notes that survive carry little landmines. Existing wall, origin uncertain. A plat marks a structure that, by the first official survey after the fire, is gone. Elevation notations appear after the fact, as if the hill rose when the ink dried. In a drawer, a clerk copies an old riverfront alignment into a new ledger, then crosses it out and writes the canal line that just got funded. 2 cities now exist, the one that was and the one the debt requires. What we're left with are mismatches that don't explain themselves. A directory lists a cooperage at an address that the post-fire city swears didn't exist. A banker files collateral tied to a block whose lots were merged in the renumbering and somehow gained square footage in the process. A schoolboy in 1853 learns a new map without knowing he's learning which streets get repaved first to meet bond covenants. Fires erase words, but not all words die. Some get rearranged to serve a schedule. Stones gave us thresholds without doors. Now the papers give us doors without keys. Map wars when streets don't match their stories. While the ash was still warm, cartographers sharpened pencils. That's where the next fracture shows, on paper that swears it's neutral. Start with a Sanborn fire insurance map, printed decades after the blazes, confident like a witness with a perfect memory. Corner of a rebuilt block in Lower Manhattan. Brick, 4 stories, tin roof, hazard class noted. Then lay a city directory from 5 years earlier across it. Same corner, same year. A cooperage and a bakery share a number that the Sanborn says never existed. The directory lists an owner. The map lists a footprint that erases him. In Hamburg's new plan, the medieval tangle becomes wide boulevards, handsome alignments that photograph well. But a surviving sketch from a surveyor who walked the ruins has a notation that feels like a cough. Existing wall, origin uncertain. His pencil line bends around a foundation that the official reconstruction pretends was never there. You can't insure a wall that doesn't have a story, so the wall loses its name. The boulevard wins. Watch how canals and rails slice. In St. Louis, a rail alignment approved on a Thursday cuts clean through a cluster of unknown foundations a month later. The permit books record progress, not archaeology. Crews hit stone that wasn't supposed to be under fill, shrug, and plow. In the report to council, the foreman writes encountered debris. A man who once tinted those stones with lime for his shopfront reads the word and doesn't recognize his past in it. Elevation is where the paper flinches hardest. Post-fire surveys describe levels with a crispness that implies they knew before they lifted. But earlier plats, when you can find them, hum with uncertainty. Not because surveyors were lazy, because they were measuring a living grade that would be rewritten. Look closely and you'll see the sequence in reverse. The new curb height is declared as if it had always been so. The older, lower step is noted indirectly when a basement is called practicable for occupation, a euphemism that means ground once met that door. Here's a clerk's nightmare turned into a city's habit, renumbering. It sounds harmless: tidy up the sequence, adopt odd-even standards, fix duplicates. Yet a street that ran from 1 to 99 becomes 100 to 300 overnight. A butcher who was 17 is now 214. His supplier mails invoices to an address that drifts like a boat. Title abstracts try to track the jump with cross-index tables, and then one binder goes missing. Ask today for 17 and the archivist smiles. That's pre-renumbering. Ask for the crosswalk and you get inconclusive. The map wins arguments by exhausting you. Sanborns love detail and that betrays them. They draw vault lights over sidewalks in Seattle as little circles, a neat constellation that says, in effect, there's a city below your city. They don't narrate the why, they annotate the hazard. In Chicago, they shade old areaways, those voids under sidewalks that fed coal into what used to be your front room. The legend calls them exposures. The old threshold becomes a risk category. Your door is now a liability symbol. Plats from before the 1870s sometimes show structures that are labeled supposed or reported, a cartographer's way of saying, I didn't see it, but people swear it's there. Then the first official surveys after the fires omit them with a different honesty, silence. The omission isn't an erasure, it's a declaration that nothing older than the plan deserves a label. If your foundation didn't fit the new angle of the street, it becomes geology. Now follow a canal proposed in the 1850s across a city that once breathed without it. The line drawn in pencil tightens into ink, then into blueprinted certainty. Workmen dig and find stone where the map promises clay. A note gets added, remove old wall. The map's next edition loses the note, keeps the canal. To a future reader, the old wall never happened. To the men who hauled it out, it was heavy and real and in the way. Counterpoints aren't weak here, they're strong. Clerical errors proliferate when cities double in size. Directories misprint names, speculative plats draw buildings that never get financed, maps lag reality by a season. Insurance cartographers standardize symbols because they need to assess risk across hundreds of towns. Precision is a business model, not a conspiracy. Yes, and yet the mismatches stack in the same places as the buried doors and the burned records. Micro story, a Boston surveyor in 1852 writes Old Wharf Line along a block now 3 lots inland. He's copying from a chart older than his training. 2 weeks later, the wharf is legally gone. Landfill has turned water into taxable ground. A fishmonger whose father paid to tie up there now pays to front a street he never asked for. For him, the map didn't describe a change, it created one. Across town, a rail map draftsman in the 1860s is told to show clean routes, no nuisances, no complications. He erases a row of unnumbered sheds with a confident hand. On Saturday, he walks home past those same sheds and buys a loaf from a woman who's baked there for 20 years. On Monday, the sheds are condemned as unsafe projections beyond the new line. His line. Maps don't just record cities, they choose them. In the wake of fire and lift and regrade, the choice tends to point one way, toward consistency with debt schedules, with sanitary boards, with routes that promise speed. The old city exists in pencil margins and annotations nobody bothers to carry forward. When you stand on a corner and your directory says a tavern should be here, room for 30 live music nights, and the Sanborn calls it vacant lot, you're not holding two truths. You're holding a before, and an after that someone bound into one book and called a fact. When stones, fires, and maps hum the same note, the question becomes, who tuned them? The power swap, new barons, new myths. When stones and maps drift, someone steers. After the ash cooled and the curbs rose, a new class of caretakers arrived with ledgers in one hand and blueprints in the other. They didn't seize the city by marching in. They scheduled it. City halls that had met in wood-paneled rooms now convened under cast-iron beams to approve one thing over and over, improvements funded by bonds. You can almost hear the Frays snapping into place, public good, private underwriting, interest due. Look at who thrives in that rhythm. Ward bosses who count votes and count crews. Contractors who confront labor on promised notes because a syndicate guaranteed their receivables. Railmen who don't just lay track, they set time itself by persuading cities to standardize hours around their timetables. A courthouse replaces a chapel on the square, and it's not a war on faith. It's a pivot in authority. Disputes once settled with a handshake and a ledger in the back room now resolve under a clock and a seal. Sewers and waterworks become empires, not because pipes are glamorous, because flows are leverage. To trench a main, you need right-of-way. To gain right-of-way, you need ordnance power. Eminent domain, once an edge case, moves to the middle of the stage. A line of pipe runs through an old block, and by necessity, the block is replatted. The men who own the bonds that bought the pipe don't attend the ribbon cutting. They don't need to. Repayment schedules have already fixed which streets are priority, which buildings count as unsafe projections, and which parcels must be combined to meet frontage rules for hydrants and access. Debt governance is dull on the page and sharp in the world. After 1840s fires, councils sell debt fast. The terms look civic, Interest wrapped in promises of stone pavements, iron shutters, disciplined alley widths, but debt ages into discipline. Miss a payment and statutes kick in that escalate enforcement. A row that survived flame gets shaved because bondholders require fire breaks. A stoop becomes illegal because the new grade says so. The calendar in the treasurer's office marks interest dates. The inspector's office quietly aligns demolitions and acceptances to those same ticks. Education does its quiet work too. If the city's body is being rebuilt, its memory needs to match. New readers arrive in classrooms with maps that delete doubts. The tangled older plan is labeled medieval with a sniff. The new grid is healthy. Textbooks debut civic heroes with shovels and slide rules. The cholera years are framed as cautionary tales cured by pipes, not as context for exiles and erasures. Local folklore, those stories about a vanished tavern under the new courthouse lawn, gets filed under charming myths. In the museum, vitrines hold curated fragments that confirm the official arc: chaos, fire, order. Who Profits isn't a cartoon, it's a coalition. Industrial trusts win bulk contracts for iron fronts, stone sills, terracotta cornices. Insurers rewrite the actuarial table to price what's now decent construction. Land banks specialize in assembling awkward, fire-sliced lots into tidy rectangles a bond council prefers. Newspaper magnates sell a feeling, rebirth, and an index of winners with photos of gleaming facades and smiling aldermen. None of these men thinks of himself as a villain. They think of themselves as organizers of improvement. The ledger agrees, right up until you notice which columns never stop growing. Meanwhile, star-shaped earthworks rebrand without a fuss. A battery becomes a promenade. Fort Wood's geometry hides beneath Liberty's skirts, the teeth smoothed into a pedestal. On coastlines, glacis grasses over and is called a lawn, while the rights to develop nearby wharves consolidate in a trust with tight ties to the same banks underwriting city debt. Defense dissolves into leisure at the exact moment utilities harden into monopolies. If you grew up near one of these parks, you remember kites, not cannons. You didn't hear the older function in the slope under your shoes. A micro story: a contractor in the 1850s wins a bid to regularize a block where half the buildings survived last winter's fire. He pays his men in scrip he discounts through a bank that holds the city's bonds. He tears down 3 stout wooden houses that a year ago passed inspection because the new ordinance calls their stairways unsafe. He's not lying. The stairways don't match the new grade. He finishes on time. The paper praises his efficiency. At night, he tilts back in a saloon chair and admits to a friend that he found a brick arch buried under the new curb, big enough to drive a wagon through. He didn't tell the supervisor. The schedule didn't have a line item for wondering. Counterpoints deserved their breath. Mid-century cities were swelling. Immigrants poured in. Cholera forced sanitation science to grow up. Railroads demanded predictable crossings and level rights-of-way. Centralized schools and record-keeping are hallmarks of a modern state, not a plot. True. But watch where modernization lands first, who gets bought out, who gets bought in. The inevitable often happens on a timetable, and the timetable's author is rarely the voter. This is the moment some viewers say, maybe it's just progress. That's fair. But progress with a metronome is still a song someone chose. We'll test that thought against a harder fact next. Graves that move when streets rise. Bones in the basement, human costs beneath our feet. Progress doesn't walk alone, it steps over bones. The first sign isn't dramatic, just a crew trenching along a street that recently got improvement funds. A backhoe teeths the soil, the bucket rises, and a tibia rides the dirt like driftwood. Work stops for a minute, then starts again. The foreman radios Potter's Field. Everybody nods. Nobody asks why the skull wore a pewter button in its mouth. This isn't a one-city story. Sewer digs have a way of dragging up what paperwork tried to file away. In New York, City Hall Park's soil told on the living when African graves surfaced near the commons, bones wrapped in the quiet that only power can impose. In London, Bazalgette's tunnels met history head-on. Workmen documented disturbances that turned out to be burial grounds swollen by earlier epidemics. Reports used words like necessary removal and sensitive handling. On the ledger line for pipeline progress, the numbers never blinked. New Orleans lays a different layer over the same pattern. Drainage canals slice through old ground that soaked up centuries of loss. When the trenchers reach what the map calls neutral soil, they find coffins stacked like books, some collapsed, some holding. The note in the daybook is brisk: water table interference, quick reinterment. No forensics, no ages logged. A priest is summoned, a blessing is mumbled, the bucket turns again. Across the channel, Dublin's sewer works bite into fields the city later labels Potter's Fields. The sequence is always strange. The discovery comes first, the label later. A clerk updates a map to extend a cemetery boundary retroactively, a cartographic kindness that covers a bureaucratic decision. Keep digging. A streetcar line will ride above a trench that passed through more history than any museum case can hold. Pandemics offer cover that officials don't have to invent. Cholera and typhus killed at speed. Cities buried fast, but speed doesn't explain the secrecy. Newspaper clippings treat finds like weather unavoidable, unremarkable, barely worth a column inch. Remains discovered during improvements, the line goes, as if the dead cooperated by waiting until a modern plan required their exit. When a reporter lingers, an alderman reminds him the public wants clean water, not old news. Listen for the euphemisms. Embellishment, for shaving a hill over a burial yard. Sanitation, for regrading a block that hides a trench of ribs. Embankment stabilization, for dumping coffin wood into fill to hold a new key. The language sands down edges until the living can walk barefoot over what they used to call neighbors. Here's the part that tilts the room. The graves don't just lie under parks or fringe lots. They surface under streets that the city swears were always streets, under buildings whose cornerstones brag about respectable dates. A hotel renovates a kitchen and finds a row of cut stones arranged like benches along a wall no plan admits. When the contractor taps the mortar, he hears the hollow signature of a vault. He calls no one. He pours. Micro story, a Paris night soil man in the 1850s trades roots with a sewer inspector. They descend a new tunnel and meet an older brickwork that shouldn't exist. Arches tighter, courses cleaner, the geometry more careful than the project's own. In the chamber beyond, stacked femurs. The inspector writes ossuary encroachment, a phrase that moves responsibility elsewhere. He lights his pipe, stares at the curve of the older vault and says, "We're late guests." In Philadelphia, Fort Mifflin's grounds change hands and uses. Soldiers become prisoners, then caretakers of lawns that once aimed cannon. A maintenance crew resetting a path edges their spades into soil and hits wood. The box gives. The report mentions historic interments relocated. The paperwork lists counts, not names. Grass rolls back over a history book closed without reading. When bodies move, stories must move too. Boundaries adjust to hide the movement. A memorial green expands on a map even as the path of a new main slices where the dead lay. The city issues a proclamation about respect. The backhoe lurches forward. The calendar can't miss the bond payment. Counterpoints? They're real. Epidemics required speed and volume. Cities with shallow water tables and sand subsided, coffins surfaced in storms. Work crews aren't archaeologists, they have schedules and safety to mind. But patterns also breathe. The finds cluster along the same corridors as the debt-funded pipes. The retroactive cemetery lines appear after bids are awarded. The press uses the same phrases from city to city as if copy had a template. Consider the human math. Workhouse rolls spike in the 1840s and 1850s. Orphanages fill. Labor drafts pull men into improvements that cut through their own quarters. The same hand that signs for lime and brick signs for quick reburial. The same boots that haul cast iron tread soil that was warm once. A digger pockets a token found with a jaw, an amusement hall check from a theater the map forgot. He keeps it in a tin with his pay slips. He never tells his son where it came from. In the end, the city gets its water and its clean lines. The living get predictability. The dead get stacked phrases and fast shovels. If you stand over a manhole and feel a draft, remember it's not just air that moves under there. Memory does too, channeled and gated, redirected when necessary. Stones gave us thresholds, papers gave us debt clocks, bones give us the bill. The language reset, how words sanded down the past. Words did work the shovels couldn't. After bones surfaced and doors sank, officials reached for terms that calmed hands and closed files. Improvement, sanitation, regrade, embellishment, each sounded like care, each concealed a cut. Listen to how improvement walks into a room. It doesn't accuse, it promises. A council minutes book reads, authorize improvements along South Wharf, straighten line, regularize frontage, remove unsafe projections. Unsafe projections are stoops that no longer meet the new curb. Regularize means erase the odd angles left by older plots. Straighten the line means forget the lane that once curved to a vanished market. The sentence hides the surgery. The vote carries. Sanitation is stronger medicine. In a cholera decade, it's a trump card. A report cites miasma and foul airs, language of a science still finding its footing, and then prescribes pipe and grade. Who argues with survival? A block goes under the plow, a pump station rises, and with it a phrase, necessary works. Necessary is a broom that sweeps dissent into a corner. When a tenant asks why her parlor window now stares into soil, the inspector shrugs, sanitation like gravity spoke. Regrade sounds technical, engineers talk for shifting earth in service of gravity. In notices, it's paired with assessments and offsets, almost kind. The city will regrade, the property owner is assessed, offsets available for conformity works. Conformity works means new steps, new lintels, bricked windows. The vocabulary turns choices into compliance. You can comply or fall out of the document. No one writes, "We buried your door." Embellishment is softer, a city's way of saying we're making it pretty. Streets get trees, walks get pavers, river walls get dressed. Under the ribbon cuttings, bulk fill pins a slope that used to breathe, and the story of the slope, what was built there, what was buried there, becomes an aesthetic option. If you raise a fuss, you're against beauty. If you raise a history, you're against progress. The word smiles while it covers a grave. Architecture admits a lot under the banner of style. When a facade doesn't fit the clean family trees taught in drawing rooms, the catalog finds a drawer labeled Revival. Renaissance Revival, Romanesque Revival, Gothic Revival. A doorjamb with a profile that doesn't match the decade's textbooks gets folded into a revival with a shrug. Mystery masonry becomes a callback. A star-shaped earthwork landscaped as a park sits under a plaque that praises its picturesque embankments, a phrase that edits artillery angles into scenery. Museums learn the same tone. Curation becomes alignment, not inquiry. Exhibits narrate the march from timber towns to iron front metropolises in a straight line. Odd stones, bricks from a lower level older than the street claiming them, are placed as curios, not as questions. Labels choose verbs: was improved, was rebuilt, was regularized. Passive voice floats above the fact that somebody chose which block to regularize and which to leave alone. Language also invents folklore to domesticate anomalies. A sealed doorway becomes a tale about smugglers. Bricked windows turn into vampire lore. A sunken lane is haunted. The stories keep the inconvenient alive, but as theater. The city smiles and nods, local color. Meanwhile, the permit office stamps another conformity notice. The tale keeps people listening in the wrong direction. A clerk's pen finishes what flames started. In a renumbering ordinance, the recital reads, "For the avoidance of confusion," as if confusion were a natural fog descending on streets. The ordinance eliminates duplicates, shuffles sequences, and in the gap, older addresses lose traction. When a claimant waives a lease from before the fire, the council replies with today's numbering and yesterday's confusion. The paper speaks a new world into force. Textbooks train children's eyes to prefer the new map. They learn to call the older pattern irregular and the newer healthy. They memorize dates, the fire, the flood, the sewer. The page asks no one to wonder why the healthy map required bricking up 100 splendid windows. The grammar of the captions carries certainty like a torch. Questioning belongs to the past. Even time gets standardized into a story. Church bells replaced, civic clocks swapped, rail time adopted, each is progress in the index. The verbs stay bloodless, installed, synchronized, adopted. Behind them, the city's rhythms change. A market that opened at first light now opens at 9. An alley that pulsed at dusk gets called a nuisance after the clock's face is gaslit. The ordinance reads for uniformity. The language makes the change gentle. Counterpoints deserve plain words. Taxonomies evolve because chaos needs baskets. Curators standardize so collections can be compared. Health boards use firm terms because epidemics don't wait. True. But there's a second job words do, smoothing conflict into consensus. When the same phrases recur, improvement, regularization, sanitary necessity, right where the ground disagrees with the paper, pay attention. Microstory, a junior architect draws a facade survey. He notes an ornate keystone half buried, writes nonconforming, and circles it. His supervisor returns the sheet with a red line, reduced. The word doesn't mean scaled, it means diminished. The stone loses a century in that stroke. The drawing goes to file, the keystone goes to ground. And then there's the file stamp that ends debates. Inconclusive. Archivists aren't villains, they're careful. But when a thread pulls toward a seam the city doesn't want to see, inconclusive does quiet work. A box marked street level shifts, 1850s, never returns from cataloging. A margin note that said existing wall, origin uncertain, gets retyped without the uncertainty. The past learns new manners. Language didn't raise streets or light fires. It did something as lasting. It taught generations how to describe
Forts
what
without
happened
cannons,
without touching
the
a
star-shaped
bruise.
puzzle.
Follow the buried streets out to the edges where cities once bristled, and the ground draws geometry your teacher called obsolete. Star forts, they said, Vauban's logic in earth and brick, pretty in diagrams, pointless once shells could arc. The plaques agree. The slopes where cannon mouths once glared now host picnics and joggers. But stand on one point and look across the ditch to the next. There's a precision that feels more than decorative, more than a leftover chapter in a military manual. Fort Wood in New York is the cleanest reveal because you can still see its teeth from above. 11 points lock into each other like a key. The Statue of Liberty's pedestal nests inside it, swallowing the geometry and leaving only hints. Guides talk about symbolism and donations. The star's function is called foundation, as if the angles were just bodyweight spreaders and not an intentional shape with consequences. The rebrand is tidy. Fort to pedestal, battery to promenade, artillery arc to viewing platform. Across harbors, the same move repeats. Coastal batteries become lawns with names you learn in school trips. A glacis becomes a sledding hill, the casemate's seal. In brochures, the word picturesque does heavy work, turning engineered plains into scenery. On Starfort lists, you'll read, decommissioned, landscaped, open to public. The dates drift toward a cluster, mid to late 19th century, right when street levels jumped and fiery designs hardened into new grids. Defense goes quiet as utilities get loud. Here's where the stones start humming with the rest. City plans radiate from these nodes in ways that suit more than cannons. Streets chain out along angles that once served fields of fire, yes, but also serve flows of people, water, power. Walk the lines and you find conduits beneath them, vaults under sidewalks, culverts marching along the same vectors. Later gaslight grids sit comfortably atop earlier voids. It's not proof of anything mystical. It's evidence of reuse, old geometry made to carry new purpose. Engineers knew acoustics and hydraulics before they knew electricity by name. A ditch is a drain. A covered way is a channel. A bastion's point can break wind and water. Label that defense and you aren't wrong, but watch how quickly the same forms host pipes once the cannon roll away. In some coastal forts, water batteries literally line the tide, their galleries vault-thick, cool, and dry, ideal for running things that shouldn't freeze or overheat. After decommissioning, you don't need to invent tunnels. You inherit them. A micro-story, a park superintendent in the 188s unlocks a bricked casemate to check for vagrants. His lantern shows whitewashed vaults and a floor too clean for disuse. In one corner, a wooden box marked City Stores sits against a wall that sweats faintly even in cold. He reports the break-in risk, not the humidity. 2 years later, a pipe route avoids the fort by a polite curve on the plan. On the ground, the plan bends toward the brick door. Another, a dock company buys land abutting a decommissioned bastion, promising beautification and access. They lay paths, plant elms, and petition for a small pump house by the slope. The minutes read like a hymn to recreation. The pump house feeds an intake that just happens to run under the old covered way, because the right-of-way already exists in everyone's habits, if not on paper. Counterpoint stays honest. Star forts were built for guns, artillery advanced. Rifled cannon and high-angle fire made low masonry vulnerable. Earth took over as the smarter absorber. That's history's main road, but secondary roads aren't fiction. The timing of decommissioning, post-1840s into the age of bond-funded improvements, rhymes with the rest of the story. The star shapes don't vanish. They stop being forts and start being platforms, their legal identities stripped, their physical advantages quietly booked to new departments. Language follows the shovel. Battery becomes park. Glacis becomes greensward. Sallyport becomes service entrance. Little doors set into slopes don't need to be named at all if the public walks above them and never asks where the hill drains. Tour guides point to cannon embrasures and talk about bravery. They don't point to culvert mouths and talk about capacity. Walk the line of points and test the slopes with your ear. In some places, drop a coin at one angle and hear it answer at another, a trick of sound born of shape. An officer would have used that to carry orders. A foreman could use it to listen for flow. Neither needs a conspiracy. Both rely on geometry. If you inherit a shape that multiplies voice and conducts water, and you're running a city that now thinks in pipes and timetables, you don't demolish a tool, you rename it. Look again at the radiating streets from these nodes. In peacetime, they're handsome. In a rebuild, they're efficient. When a city raises its grade and redraws its map, pulling lines from a central star gives you order fast. Surveyors love anchors. Bond councils love predictable blocks. A decommissioned fort offers both, fixed points, stable ground, a reason to make the new plan meet there. This is the false ending some people accept. The forts were obsolete, so they became parks. Of course they did, but keep the rhythm in mind. Doors sank, fires ate ledgers, maps rationalized. debt scheduled the rebuild. And at the edges, stars lost cannons and gained paths. If these were only leftovers, they wouldn't align so neatly with the pipes and rights-of-way that followed. If they were only parks, their basements wouldn't stay so useful. So ask the quiet question. If not only defense, what else did these shapes serve as the 19th century rehung its cities? Our next step chases that utility, under streets into vaults, along conduits that predate their paperwork. The extraction hypothesis, digging for utility, not war. Follow those star lines beneath the grass and you find something stubborn. Utility before narrative, not magic use. Under street vaults run like capillaries beneath the sidewalks of older cores, some bricked, some arched, some glazed with a whitewash that resists damp. They aren't catacombs, they're spaces hung with the ghosts of functions, hooks for lamps, iron rings for cables, chutes that once fed coal but line up too neatly with nothing the permit books will name. In cities where cannons retired, these voids stayed on payroll, wearing new job titles without new walls. Look at the overlaps. Gaslight grids mapped in the 1850s and 1860s love routes already carved. Pipes seek the easiest beds, and old covered ways are easy if you can pretend they aren't there. In some blocks, the vault lights we admired on Seattle's sidewalks aren't random decorations. They're an admission that the level beneath needed daylight because it wasn't dead. Merchants used it, inspectors checked it, and utilities threaded through it like vines through a trellis someone else planted. Banks and civic halls tell a related story with their shoes off. Under certain 19th century courthouses, mystery tunnels reach neighboring blocks, too stout to be drains, too dry to be neglected. Guides mutter about prohibition or smugglers because those tales sell well. But the brickwork dates to before the bottles and before the law. Doors with institutional hinges go nowhere, except they do. They go to alignments that mirror early service corridors drawn on post-fire plans. The city down there looks like a service diagram learned by heart, not a rabbit warren. Now stand back and follow ownership. When Star Bastion lands were beautified, industrialists acquired parcels abutting them on good terms. Docks companies, water boards, even gas trusts petitioned for easements that, on paper, served public recreation and access. The minute you walk the lines, the access looks like something else. Clean vectors to intakes and pumping basements. A pump house added as an ornament on a park plan is a puzzle piece that fits a bigger machine. Here's the hinge that turns a fort into a platform. Hydro and acoustic sense. Earthworks shed water predictably, feed runnels toward ditches that can be captured, channeled, or raised to pressure with the right head. A bastion's points don't just rake a field of fire, they divide and gather flow. Utilities in their infancy were agnostic about names. If a shape conducted, they used it. A buried casemate with dry air is a gift if you're stringing lines that spark easily, or storing regulators that prefer constant temperature. If you inherit vaults that whisper complaints from one end to another, you've also inherited a monitoring system before dials. Send a man to listen, and he'll hear when something fails. Counter-arguments carry weight. Service tunnels were built beside infrastructure as infrastructure. Mail tubes buzzed under streets. Gas mains needed access points. Many mystery corridors have plaques that say exactly what they were. Fine, but the chronology matters. When a corridor's brickwork predates the service it conveniently houses by a generation, you aren't looking at coincidence. You're looking at adaptive reuse, the kind that hides its debts to older plans by letting the new plan take credit. Micro story: a city electrician in the 1890s follows a line fault to a hatch tucked into a park slope, a holdover from an older gun position. Inside, the air is still and cool, dry enough to keep paper crisp. He finds not a rat's nest, but a junction box mounted on timber set against lime plaster. The cable run is recent. The room is. He notes legacy chamber sound, chalks an arrow toward a culvert mouth that hums at a frequency you feel in your molars, and leaves with the fault fixed and a superstition he won't laugh about. Another, a water board foreman petitions for authority to improve drainage on the backside of a decommissioned rampart. The map sketch shows a meandering trench, scenic, dotted with trees. The build crew cuts straight along a buried retaining wall, drops glazed pipe into a bed tamped by boots that haven't walked there in 50 years, and connects to a chamber no ordnance lists. The minutes file the job under beautification. The pressure in the city's highest taps finally stabilizes. Early gaslight grids overlay older conduits like children tracing adults' footprints. In districts where the star radii set the street plan, you can test a suspicion. Pick a spoke and walk it. You'll step over a repeating set, Manholes aligned at tidy intervals, iron doors tucked into berms, mysterious ventilation grills in walls that never faced a room. The pattern looks like logistics more than lore. If the bastion was a battery, the city inherited its habit of distribution, the art of moving something quickly from a central node along predefined lanes. Even bank tunnels, the ones under civic halls, city treasuries, and exchanges, have a logic beyond robbery and flight. A tunnel that ushers clerks between vault and office through a dry, guarded tube is a management of risk, yes, but it also mirrors the city's new flows, secure, invisible, maintained. When those tubes line up with older covered ways, you aren't glimpsing a conspiracy as much as a city learning to breathe through existing lungs. What nobody needs to claim is secret electricity or lost tech. The point is less glamorous and more convincing. City makers in the mid to late 19th century found ready-made geometries and voids and pressed them into utility. The paperwork called it progress. The ground called it continuity. Label a casemate a storeroom, a sally port a service entrance, a counterscarp a drain, and you've translated war into water and light. This is where a tidy explanation tries to settle. Reuse explains everything. And for a lot, it does. But reuse alone doesn't tell you why censuses around these nodes wobble, or why directories list vacancies in the shadow of infrastructure that hums. It doesn't explain population puzzles that yawn exactly where platforms grow. We follow the hum into the headcounts next. The people who weren't there, population puzzles. Numbers should be the sober friend in a story like this. They twitch. Open a census ledger near an improved corridor and watch headcounts dip where you'd expect them to surge. A block listed as uninhabited sits between two streets that throbbed with life in the directories the same year. The ink doesn't blush. It just leaves a blank where noise used to be. Start with the rhythm we already know. Fire, finance, grade. Now read the people into it. After the Panic of 1837, work dried up, then debt hardened. By the mid-1840s, cities were selling bonds and buying labor. Improvement wasn't just brick and pipe, it was bodies drafted, day-waged, lodged in barracks, and counted strangely. You see census jumps near construction yards and dips beside finished mains. The people didn't vanish. They moved off the page. Directories tell a different tale with a grin and a limp. In one year, you'll find a row of names, baker, cooper, midwife, on a street that the federal roll marks vacant. The directory compilers walked blocks, asked neighbors, scribbled occupations. The census enumerators followed routes approved by supervisors with deadlines tied to other deadlines. If a corridor was under improvement, access got fenced. A clerk could mark temporarily uninhabited and keep moving. The word temporarily has a habit of becoming forever when the renumbering ordinance lands. Workhouses spike in the 1840s and 1850s, and the curves aren't gentle. Orphanages swell. The same season that bonds are floated for sewers, requisitions for bread in the almshouse rise. It reads like compassion until you follow the outflow. From those rooms, labor drafts push men to the very trenches that cut through their blocks. They're housed on site. They're absent on paper. A boarding house that held 12 last year holds none this year because its residents sleep in sheds behind a pumping station's fence. Micro-story, a widow runs a chop stall on a lane marked for widening. She's listed at number 9 in the spring directory, beef and broth. By autumn, the lane's frontage is regularized, her doorway a projection. She moves her pot and her bed to a cousin's. The next census calls her old address cleared. She isn't dead. She's 2 alleys over in a room that now counts under a different number if it counts at all. Her customers follow their noses, not the map. Whole tenements get relabeled unfit the month a contractor posts bond. The people inside scatter along kinship lines and hiring gates. Enumerators return to a boarded stairwell and write none. 12 lives turn into a blank that future historians will mistake for empty land. And when the site reopens with a brick terrace and iron hydrants, the count returns. New names, higher rents, cleaner ledgers. Look at port cities during cholera years and you'll see a second mask. Epidemics kill, they also justify movement. Quarantine zones redraw where you can sleep. Blocks get cordoned and then improved. When the cordon lifts, the census notes a drop as if disease took everyone. Some were taken. Others were priced out by the new insurance tables, charging premiums only healthy construction can bear. A family of 6 squeezes into 2 rooms across the parish line. They vanish from the old count and appear as lodgers, where the official story says growth was organic. There's a stranger hiccup near star node districts that became parks. You'd expect leisure to draw residents. Instead, you find a low occupancy ring, big houses empty for repairs, terraces with caretakers but few households. On weekdays, foremen's logs show dozens of men underground in maintenance. On census night, the park precinct reads quiet. The neighborhood breathes, but not with home life. It hums with function. Counterpoints matter. Migration was a tide. Irish families fled famine, Germans fled revolution, country folk fled crop failure. Counting all that in neat columns is hard. Enumerators were human, mistakes multiply in noise. But follow the miscounts along the same corridors that debt funded and maps rationalized, and the error starts to look like policy's shadow. The empties appear where a bond schedule needs a clean run. The spikes show in sheds behind sites labeled civic improvement. Micro story: a boy in 1851 sleeps in a tool room under a courthouse stair. His father strings gas pipe along a trench that swallowed his uncle's shop. The ledger calls their nights temporary housing, works. The census man knocks at dusk, meets a locked door at street grade and marks none. 2 names fall out of history because a gate kept time for the bond. Orphanage rolls aren't just heartbreak, they're indicators. When a city flattens a warren of courts into a square, kin networks snap. Children separated for health enter institutions that suddenly need bigger kitchens. Meanwhile, schools report irregular attendance near improvement corridors, boys taken to carry bricks, girls taken to wash for crews. Absences write themselves into adulthood as uncounted lives. And then there are the vacant lots that host markets every dawn. A plat after a fire erases shacks with a ruler. A census taken at 9 a.m. on a weekday calls the square empty. At 6 a.m., 100 vendors stood there under patched awnings. They pay stall fees at a desk labeled temporary. Temporary outlasts memory when the new hall opens a block away and charges rent. Here's the bruise: when people vanish on paper, property consolidates in fact. Titles move faster when no tenant names clutter hearings. Assessors reclassify value. A landlord resisting a buyout loses leverage if his building is unoccupied. He knows it is. The form says it is. He sells. Population is supposed to tell us who we were. In rebuild decades, it tells us who got counted where the bond clock allowed doors to stay open. The rest lived, worked, loved, and slept in the city we built above the lines, present and missing at once. The debt cleanse, financial resets in plain sight. Follow the money and the rubble starts making sense. Fires and regrades gave politicians cover and engineers work, but what stitched the tempo was debt, created fast, serviced for decades, and used like a crowbar. The meetings after the blazes weren't poetry, they were math. Councils authorized bonds at speed, often in special sessions held in borrowed rooms because the old ones were ash. The language was civic: improvements, safety, health. The instruments were commercial: coupons, maturities, call provisions. A city learned to breathe by inhaling credit. Look at how the instruments walked into daily life. A municipal bond isn't a brick, but it decides where bricks go. After Hamburg's core burned, underwriting syndicates formed with a neat symmetry: local banks for face, outside houses for depth. New York wrote bonds tied to specific works: widened streets, iron shutters, warehouses with less appetite for flame. St. Louis pledged future levies to rebuild a riverfront with straighter wharves and bigger sheds. In each case, repayment schedules set dates that inspectors later used as deadlines. A debt calendar became a demolition calendar. Here's the trick you only see when you press nose to ledger: categories hardened around interest. Unsafe wasn't just a judgment, it was a trigger. If a block could be declared unsafe, it could be cleared to meet a bond covenant that promised widened rights of way or a fire break by year's end. Structures that had survived fire fell to timetables. A stoop over the old curb line wasn't quaint, it was non-compliant. The contractor who tore it out could discount his scrip at a bank that held the city's notes. Everyone got paid in a circle that began with ash and ended with coupons clipped on a kitchen table across town. Old debts didn't survive the heat. Offices where liens slept turned into light. Courts later faced neat disputes. Proof was ash, claimants were alive, lenders were impatient. Lost in the fire did legal work some fair much final. Titles got quieted when copies couldn't be produced. Mortgages faded if the archive that housed them became smoke. Notaries swore to intentions. Judges swore to order. What fell through the cracks fell into opportunity. Land banks, young but hungry, stepped in to stabilize parcels by buying ambiguous titles cheap, then bundling them into clean rectangles bond councils preferred. Insurance wasn't just indemnity, it was consolidation. Payouts arrived for some, denials for many, and assessments rose next renewal. Owners without cash to upgrade to fireproof sold to parties who could, often the same syndicates selling the city its debt. Newspapers praised the result: rows of iron fronts, disciplined cornices, respectable distances between buildings. In classifieds, auction notices multiplied, small type for small holders, big type for big tracts. The word rebirth wore a bow tie. The word foreclosure wore none. Improvements didn't only aim at flames. Debt loved straight lines because straight lines make collections simpler. A kinked lane confuses assessors, a rectangular block does not. Post-fire plats bled out the meanders and left right angles. Where the ground disagreed, fill supplied compliance. Assessments rose on schedule, interest due quarter days, principal due in tranches, the papers printed as if times and dates were natural facts, not negotiations. Miss a call, lose a corridor. A city's shape learned punctuality. Micro-story, a grocer owns his shop and the upstairs room's free of encumbrance, he thinks. The deed sat in a solicitor's drawer on the night the district glowed like a furnace. 2 months later, he faces a board that approves his rebuilding plans only if he sets his front back 8 feet. He can't afford it. A gentleman from a land bank offers help. Sell now, lease back later at a fair rent. The grocer signs. 10 years on, he still sells apples under his own painted name. The wall behind him belongs to a trust. Another, a mason, wins city work, resetting steps to meet a new curb. His pay comes as warrants discounted by a bank that owns a slice of the latest bond. He cashes at a loss because his crew needs bread. By winter, the bank has earned his margin twice, once on the discount, once on the coupon. He warms his hands by a brazier in a trench dug through a block his father told stories about. He can't prove those stories. The archive burned. Newspapers did more than cheer. They taught the public to read debt as destiny. Features explained how prudent borrowing would transform pestilential alleys into hygienic vistas. Editorials scolded obstructionists clinging to irregularities. In the classifieds, notices of bond sales sat beside notices of delinquent taxes. On page 1, the mayor cut a ribbon. On page 4, a sheriff posted an execution sale for arrears. Progress had a font size. Counterpoints stand. Cities needed capital. Bonds spread cost across generations that benefited. Accountability improved when lenders watched spending. But watch the asymmetry. Smallholders took risk with their roofs. Syndicates took coupons and collateral. Old debts dissolved with archives. New debts crystallized in vaults. Creative destruction sounds noble until you see who gets creative and who gets destroyed. Step back and the pattern clarifies. Fires and regrades opened the door. Bonds propped it. Assessments herded people through. The rebuilt core shone because it was financed to. The old one dimmed because it couldn't meet a schedule set in a room the public could enter only as audience. When a city pays yesterday's heat with tomorrow's interest, it rearranges streets, not just budgets. This is what a reset looks like in daylight, not a secret switch, a balance sheet. The cleanse wasn't moral. It was financial, visible in ordinances and coupons, in stoops sawed flush and addresses that learned new numbers because bonds required clarity. If you want to hear power, don't listen for speeches. Listen for the rustle of paper when a coupon
Timekeepers and Testimonies,
the timeline phrase. Clocks don't lie until they do. After debt calendars fixed streets, the city's other metronomes started changing hands. A parish diary in 1851 notes, "We rang at first light." 2 years later, "We now ring at 9 per city instruction." The light didn't move, authority did. When you read enough of these entries side by side, time itself looks edited. Here's a diary you'd miss if you weren't looking. A carpenter in Lower Manhattan, 1846. He writes that the curb outside his shop rose 2 handspans over the winter. Then he dates the entry twice, striking out the first day because Mr. Pike's clock disagrees with the exchange. That year, the exchange replaced its bell after the fire. The carpenter trusts the sound that calls men to trade over the son he's known since he was a boy. His street doesn't just lift, his hours tilt toward a face bolted to a facade. Meanwhile, churches replace bells in clusters, not because God asked, because the belfries burned or the bells cracked during improvements. New bronze, new tone, new minutes set to a civic clock that'll soon bow to rail time. Calendar reform debates feel distant until you see how quickly local noon becomes a nuisance. Stations publish timetables, shops adjust. A baker who served longshoremen at dawn moves his trays for a crowd that shows by 8, meaning when the station says 8. Oral histories step in where paper won't. A widow on the edge of a district we watched regrade tells her grandson about a front door you could take a carriage through. He asks where. She points to a window half in dirt. When he brings her a pamphlet that says the stoops were always grand and always high, she shakes her head and smiles the smile people wear when they know a thing won't be believed. "They weren't so proud," she says. "We stepped straight in." The pamphlet wins in classrooms. Her sentence wins at a kitchen table. Archivists do careful work with frayed threads. You'll find penciled notes, inconclusive, tucked into files about street-level shifts. A ledger that once held permits for conformity works disappears into recataloguing. Another returns missing the page that listed payouts for bricking basement windows. Ask, and a clerk will tell you space is tight, archives move, boxes get mislaid. All true. But the gaps appear where you'd want to compare testimony against ordnance. The places where a grandmother's memory rubs against a bylaw's date. Across the ocean, a Dublin journeyman's notebook remarks on new stones at Christmastide and rain pooling where it never. He doesn't sermonize, he notes. A year later he adds that the bell at St. Mickens seems eager, ringing ahead of itself, and blames the deacon. The deacon likely blamed the station. Local time slides under standardized minutes, reshaping the day without changing the sky. In the margins, the journeyman draws a small staircase that goes down from a door he loved, with a skull at the bottom as a joke. The joke reads like grief. Witnesses contradict official rebuild dates in small ways that add up. A mason swears he refaced a wall before the big fire, but the ledger puts the work post-improvement. A lamplighter tells his son he used to service a run that's now underground. The son laughs until he finds a capped pipe where the old route ran and a line of filled-in grates nobody catalogs as a system. Testimony doesn't trump paperwork, it tugs it sideways. Timekeeping standardizes as if the city were a machine needing one rhythm. Rail time arrives with whistles and tables. Offices adopt clocks regulated by telegraph. Bells harmonize. The chaos of sundials gives way to a grid of minutes. It's better for commerce. It's worse for memory. Events that used to anchor themselves to sun and season. The flood came when the chestnuts blossomed. The street rose after the second frost. Re-anchor to April 1 bond issue. September 30 inspection. People start laughing at old men who say, "Aftercent, swithin." The laughter is progress performing amnesia. Then the testimonies get stranger. A ledger clerk in an insurance office jots street already higher than plan in the 1850s, though the ordinance authorizing the regrade carries an 1851 seal. He isn't accusing anyone. He's trying to explain why a premium changed. A surveyor's field book shows a sketch of an existing wall he can't place on any sheet. He writes, "Origin uncertain," then scratches the words hard enough to groove the paper. The official map that follows ignores his groove. Meanwhile, civic clocks are swapped en masse in the years after the fires, not always because they failed, because uniformity sells the new order. City fathers pose in front of dials with clean numerals, proud of predictability. Market bells chiming by grain's readiness give way to hour strikes that don't care whether the tide came early. A fisherman will tell you the new time is wrong. He's not arguing with minutes. He's arguing with a world calibrated to paper. And when you go looking for the diaries that disagree, you'll find a pattern of absence. Collections labeled street accounts, time notes. Yard books get cited in footnotes and lost in transit. The index cards remain, the boxes don't. Ask nicely and an archivist will sigh they've been awaiting processing for years. Meanwhile, the textbook prints a tidy sequence: fire, plans, bonds, regrade, compliance. No mention that the men who cut the steps say the steps went down before the ordnance set up. This is where the line Frays, not in a headline, inhabits. Bells change pitch. Clocks take orders, diaries cross out days. Testimonies stub against tidy dates and leave scuffs you can feel with a finger. If stones and money set the frame, timekeeping varnished it. The sheen is even. Under it, brushstrokes refuse to line up. The control layer, from buried floors to digital floors. When clocks lined up and streets obeyed, the city learned its next trick: controlling movement without saying the word control. It starts small: one turnstile, one ticket window, one hinged gate where a stoop used to spill straight to street. Then it scales. Buried floors weren't just architectural ghosts, they were design lessons. Force entries to a single plane, then price the plane. Watch how access hardens. Staircases that once met the street now drop into basements branded service. The public door moves up a flight and over to an arch the inspector blessed. You need a permit to open a new door in line with the old. You need a fee to alter a curb. A clever landlord builds a vestibule that funnels foot traffic past a clerk with a ledger, because the new grade turned hello into hold on. What looks like a quirk of masonry becomes a checkpoint. Railroads write the manual. Fences appear around platforms that used to be platforms by custom. Tickets become time-stamped permission slips to cross a line on the ground. Schedules don't just keep trains punctual, they regulate bodies. If you arrive outside the minute, the gate stays closed. The logic bleeds into ferries, then markets, then fairs. A city that once breathed through alleys now inhales through turnstiles. Pipes teach a parallel lesson. Water and gas arrive behind dials and locks. You don't draw from a pump you share with neighbors anymore. You open a valve council approved. With that valve comes a meter and a rule book. Miss payment and the same men who set your step flush with the new curb clamp your flow. Control shifts from the square to the basement, from the marshal's baton to the wrench. Eminent domain, tested on rights-of-way for mains, becomes a muscle memory. Gate a lane for works, keep it gated for order. Streetcars require dedicated tracks require clearance, clearance requires policing. A boy who used to run errands across rails now waits at a painted line for a constable's nod. You can say this is safety and be right. You can also say it's training. Zoning walks in wearing a suit and carrying a map. The 20th century pretends it loves the old cores, then it walls them with rules, uses separate like oil and water. You can live here, but you can't mend shoes. You can trade there, but only if you park 2 blocks away and show a receipt for your license. The ordinance reads compatibility. The effect is curation. Who gets to be downtown and who gets priced out by compliance. Where buried floors taught vertical separation, zoning teaches horizontal distance. Permits do the slow work tickets began. A man who wants to hang a shingle meets a form that asks what, where, when, and how long. Temporary events need temporary permissions renewed on a calendar that always knows when interest is due. In a district where debt funded the pavement, renewals tend to land right before coupon dates. Fail to renew, lose the stall, miss the market, fall behind the rent. The city didn't arrest you, it starved your clock. Surveillance existed before cameras. Street grids that rationalized fire breaks also rationalized sightlines. A constable standing at one corner can read 3 blocks. Towers that once told bells now host lookouts with notebooks. When electric light arrives, poles follow the same rights-of-way as mains, brightening places schedules favor and leaving odd corners dim until a complaint passes through the right hands. Illumination is access control with a softer accent. Tickets evolve into passes. Factory gates issue chits stamped with times and colors. Ferries sell monthly books that bind your commute to a turnstile. Libraries, born noble, adopt cards that log your presence. Parks, those gentle starforts in lawn clothing, post hours and hire keepers whose keys open side doors labeled service that lead where the public doesn't walk. The idea isn't sinister, it's managerial. The effect is a culture that learns to ask permission to stand where their grandparents stood without asking. Fast forward a century and the logic clicks without friction. We invent turnstiles you can't see, barriers in code. The 202s don't need a stoop to train compliance, they need an app. Digital passes replace paper tickets. Your phone becomes the gate. A museum that sits over a vaulted basement once threaded with coal chutes now lets you in if the QR smiles. A stadium whose concourse rides a buried areaway decides which pockets you empty by policy that updates at midnight without a vote. Resource choke points stay faithful to their ancestors. Water still runs through valves, now billing lives behind passwords. Transit still flows along lines, now enforcement rides algorithms. Food takes on a system, deliveries through docks zoned into obedience, farmers' markets permitted into docility. During a crisis, the dial turns faster. Temporary restrictions, limited entries, timed slots. Temporary loves to overstay. Micro story, a clerk in a city permit office in 1908 stamps, approved on a street closure for a parade, then on a trench for a main, then on a market that must now route foot traffic through 2 openings for safety. He doesn't see a pattern, he sees tasks. A century later, his descendant taps a screen to reserve an hour in a public pool. The screen says no. No reason, just a red square where the green one used to be. She sighs and plans her day around a judgment that lives nowhere she can visit. Another, a landlord in 1893, pays to normalize his stoop to the new curb and takes the chance to add a vestibule for heat control. He hires a boy to man the door at busy hours. He calls him a porter. The boy decides who enters. Today, a co-op board calls it a fob system and hires a consultant. The difference is hardware. The lesson is the same. Narrow the entry, count the bodies, price the threshold. None of this needs a single mastermind. It needs incentives and habits. Buried floors taught how to funnel. Fires gave pretext to redraw. Bonds enforced calendars. Maps trained eyes to prefer straight lines. By the time digital gates arrived, the muscle memory was generations old. A city that learned to move people past clerks, past valves, past clocks, now moves them past prompts. Here's the quiet punchline. Control rides infrastructure more than speeches. If you can raise a street, you can raise a hoop for people to jump through. If you can turn a casemate into a storeroom, you can turn a login into a key. The forms change, the logic doesn't. The 19th century practiced on stone what the 21st perfects in code. The verdict matrix, weighing patterns against proof. Let's put feelings on a table and score what holds. Physical anomalies, high. We can touch sunken doors, vault lights, raised curbs, reused casemates. Conventional answer, regrades, drainage, settlement, also high. But the cross-city sink with fires and debt clocks nudges that needle. Paper trails, medium-high. We have documented fire clusters. Hamburg 1842, New York 1845, St. Louis 1849, followed by bonds, renumbering, and lost in the fire rulings. Counterpoint, wood, gas, crowding, credible. Still, the timing of municipal bond regimes locking rebuild schedules is a pattern, not a footnote. Maps, medium. Sanborns, plats, directories clash where pipes and rails push through. Clerical error explains noise. Repetition along improvement corridors suggests design. Not proof of concealment, proof of prioritization that overwrites older footprints. Star forts, medium. Decommissioning, park rebrands, Fort Wood under Liberty's pedestal verified. Claiming energy is a leap. Claiming adaptive reuse is conservative and supported. Bones, medium. Repeated finds during sewer works, retroactive cemetery lines, brisk reinterments documented. Epidemics explain volume, not the hush. Population, low-medium. Census dips and vacant, tags near active districts are suggestive, not dispositive. Enumeration bias is real, but the empties aligning with bond-timed works deserve more digging. Language, high for effect, low for intent. Improvement, sanitation. Regularization, smooth conflict. That's governance behavior, not necessarily plot, but it reliably hides ruptures. Where the mud flood frame stretches too far. Singular cataclysm, lost high-tech, one mastermind. Where official narratives leave gaps. Missing ledgers at decision points, mismatched dates around grade shifts, consistent understory beneath star nodes. What would falsify this? Archive runs proving pre-fire grades match post-regrade claims, independent diaries aligning with ordinances, stratigraphy showing only contemporaneous construction. What would confirm it? Pre-1840 utility corridors reused in 1850s plans, bond covenants dictating specific spatial changes, synchronized renumbering tied to debt calendars across cities. Field guide, map vault lights, areaways, and star radii, pull directories against Sanborns, red bond minutes, walk the slope. What this really means now. If their ground could be raised by schedule, ours can be steered by screen. Resets travel as methods, not myths. Want the next layer? Subscribe for the 1890s archive purges and watch the companion on resource choke points. Drop your city's anomalies, photos, dates, deeds in the comments, and send this to the friend with